The infertile wife he divorced stood in the shadows of his celebration, watching him toast his pregnant mistress with champagne he couldn't afford. But what he didn't know was that the woman he'd abandoned owned the very hospital where his mother now fought for her life, on machines he assumed were covered by insurance. She was no ordinary discarded spouse, but a legendary medical tycoon who'd built an empire while he'd been too blind to see past her empty womb. And now his mother's survival depended on the mercy of the woman he'd thrown away like garbage. He'd chosen fertility over fortune, but the mistress carrying his child knew nothing of the debt collectors circling his failing business, while his ex-wife held both his mother's medical files and the mortgage to his company in her perfectly manicured hands. The hospital hummed with her authority as she reviewed his mother's critical condition. But revenge wasn't just about denying care. It was about letting him discover piece by devastating piece that the barren woman he'd mocked was actually the silent partner who'd funded his entire career. And now she was ready to collect. Would his pregnant mistress stand by him when the bankruptcy notices arrived? Would his mother survive long enough to learn her son had destroyed the one woman who could save her? And would he finally understand that infertility was never the weakness? His greed, his betrayal, and his devastating blindness were. The divorce papers had been signed on a Tuesday, but David Mitchell remembered it as the day he'd finally chosen his future over his past. His wife of 7 years had sat across from him in the lawyer's office with dry eyes and a calm expression that had unsettled him more than tears would have. But he'd pushed that discomfort aside because Jessica was 4 months pregnant and glowing with the promise he'd always wanted. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known because he'd stopped paying attention years ago, was that the woman signing those papers controlled 43% of Mitchell Medical Supplies, the company his grandfather had founded, and that he now ran into the ground with quarterly losses he blamed on market conditions. She'd bought those shares through shell companies while he'd been busy explaining to friends that his wife's inability to conceive was destroying their marriage. But Emma Hartley had learned long ago that men like David only saw what they wanted to see. 6 months after the divorce, David stood in St. Augustine Memorial Hospital's intensive care unit, watching his mother struggle for each breath through a ventilator. Margaret Mitchell had collapsed at her garden club meeting, but the stroke had been massive and the prognosis grim. The neurologist had used words like minimal brain activity and quality of life decisions, but David had insisted on every possible intervention because that's what sons did. They fought for their mothers even when the bills were piling up like snow in a blizzard. "Mr. Mitchell, we need to discuss your account balance," the hospital administrator said, appearing at his elbow with a tablet that glowed with numbers David didn't want to see. "Your mother's care has exceeded your insurance coverage, and we require payment arrangements for continued treatment." David's jaw tightened because Jessica was at home with their newborn daughter, and his company had just lost its biggest supplier contract. But he couldn't let his mother die over money. "I'll figure it out," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion and fear. The administrator nodded with professional sympathy, but his eyes held something else, a knowing quality that made David's skin prickle. "The hospital board will be reviewing high-balance cases next week. I'd recommend securing payment before then." What David didn't understand was that the hospital board had only one person who mattered, and she'd been waiting for this moment since the day he'd told her that a real woman would have given me children by now. The story of Emma Hartley's rise was one David had never bothered to learn, but it had begun long before their marriage in the research labs of Johns Hopkins, where she'd developed a revolutionary drug delivery system at 23. She'd been a prodigy who saw patterns in molecular structures the way musicians heard symphonies in silence. But her professors had warned her that brilliance without connections would only take her so far in the pharmaceutical world. She'd met David at a medical supply conference where his family's company was exhibiting outdated equipment with impressive marketing. But his charm had been undeniable. The way he'd listened to her ideas about improving surgical tools, the way he'd made her feel seen in a world that often overlooked women in science. They'd married after a whirlwind courtship, but the romance had curdled the moment her first pregnancy test came back negative, then the second, then the 20th. "My mother wants grandchildren," David had said after year 3, as if Emma's body was a malfunctioning appliance. "Maybe we should see a specialist." They'd seen 17 specialists, but the diagnosis had always been the same: unexplained infertility, a medical mystery that Emma's brilliant mind couldn't solve for herself. David's resentment had grown with each failed cycle, but Emma had poured her grief into her work, patenting 3 more medical devices and licensing them through companies David never connected to his wife, because she'd used her maiden name professionally. When Jessica had appeared at Mitchell Medical Supplies as a sales representative with red hair and easy laughter, Emma had seen the end coming like a diagnosis written in bold print. David's late nights at the office had multiplied, but his company's numbers had continued to decline because he'd been too distracted to notice that his new sales rep was selling nothing while costing him everything. "I'm in love with someone else," David had finally admitted, but his eyes had been defiant rather than apologetic. "Jessica's pregnant. She's giving me what you never could." Emma had felt something break inside her that wasn't her heart, but rather the last thread of mercy she'd been holding for the man she'd once believed she loved. "I hope you'll be very happy," she'd said, and she'd meant it the way a surgeon means, "This won't hurt." A comforting lie before the cutting begins. The shell companies had been easy to establish for someone with Emma's resources and intelligence, but taking control of St. Augustine Memorial had required 3 years of strategic stock purchases and board manipulation. She'd become the hospital's primary shareholder, while David had been busy playing house with Jessica and their baby. But Emma had been patient because revenge rushed was revenge wasted. "Dr. Hartley, the Mitchell file is ready for your review," her assistant said, placing a thick folder on the desk of Emma's executive office, the one on the hospital's top floor that David had walked past dozens of times without realizing who occupied it. Emma opened the file with steady hands, though her pulse quickened as she saw Margaret Mitchell's deteriorating brain scans. The older woman had been kind to her once, before David had poisoned that relationship with stories about Emma's deficiencies, but kindness didn't erase the countless family dinners where Margaret had asked pointed questions about grandchildren and sighed dramatically about her friend's lucky daughters-in-law. "The account is $473,000 in arrears," the assistant continued, "and Mr. Mitchell's company just had its credit line revoked by First National." Emma had arranged that revocation through a carefully placed phone call to a bank executive who owed her a favor, but she kept her expression neutral. "And the medical prognosis? Without continued intensive support, Mrs. Mitchell has approximately 72 hours. With support, she could linger for months, but meaningful recovery is unlikely." The decision Emma faced wasn't about mercy or cruelty, but about the message she wanted to send to the man who'd reduced her worth to her reproductive system. She'd built an empire while he'd built nothing, but he'd thrown her away for a woman whose only apparent talent was getting pregnant, and now that empire could save or destroy him. "Schedule a meeting with Mr. Mitchell," Emma said quietly, closing the file. "It's time we discussed his mother's care options." David had expected to meet with a hospital administrator, or perhaps a finance manager, but the assistant who led him to the executive floor seemed too well dressed and the elevator too private. The office he entered was more penthouse than workplace. with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city and artwork that probably cost more than his house. The woman behind the desk had her back to him, studying the skyline with a posture he recognized even after 2 years. But his brain refused to process what his eyes were seeing because Emma was supposed to be alone in some apartment, childless and forgotten. Not here in this tower of power and money. "Hello, David," Emma said, turning to face him with a smile that held no warmth. "I understand you're having difficulty with your mother's hospital bills." The floor seemed to tilt beneath David's feet because this couldn't be happening, but the nameplate on the desk read, Dr. Emma Hartley, Chief Executive Officer, and the degrees on the wall were from institutions that didn't hand out credentials to anyone ordinary. You work here?" "I own here," Emma corrected, moving to sit behind her desk with the confidence of someone who'd earned every inch of her authority. "St. Augustine Memorial is my hospital, David, one of 17 healthcare facilities I control across 6 states. The words hit him like physical blows, but David's mind was racing backward through their marriage, trying to understand how he'd missed this. "You never said—" "You never asked," Emma interrupted, her voice sharp as a scalpel. "You were too busy complaining about my empty womb to notice that my patents were generating $30 million annually, or that I'd been anonymously funding your failing company for the last 5 years of our marriage." David's vision blurred because this had to be a nightmare, but Emma was pulling up documents on her computer screen, spreadsheets showing cash infusions into Mitchell Medical Supplies, all traced back to companies he now recognized as her shell corporations. She'd been saving him while he'd been betraying her, but that realization came with a horror that made him physically ill. "Why?" he managed to ask, though he wasn't sure if he meant why had she helped him, or why was she telling him now. "Because I loved you once," Emma said simply. "But that was before you decided my value as a woman was determined by my fertility rather than my mind, my work, or my devotion to a man who didn't deserve any of it." The cruelty of her words was matched only by their truth, but David's panic was rising because his mother was dying 3 floors below them, and this woman, his ex-wife, held all the power. "Emma, please, my mother needs—" "Your mother needs 24-hour intensive care that costs approximately $8,000 per day," Emma recited, pulling up another file. "Your insurance covered the first 100,000, but you're now approaching $500,000 in debt, and your company can't cover it because I've been systematically dismantling your supply contracts for the past 6 months." The confession should have shocked him, but David was beyond shock, drowning in the revelation of exactly how blind and stupid he'd been. "You're killing my business?" "Your business was already dying," Emma corrected. "I was just the one who stopped resuscitating it with anonymous loans and supplier connections. Mitchell Medical Supplies has been insolvent for 3 years, David. But you were too busy impregnating your mistress to notice that I was the only thing keeping you afloat." The flashback hit David with the force of a semi-truck, a memory he'd suppressed of Emma working late in their home office, her desk covered with files and contracts he'd never questioned. She'd told him once that she did consulting work, but he'd been watching a baseball game and hadn't cared enough to ask what kind of consulting or for whom. "You have a choice," Emma was saying, pulling him back to the present moment that felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. "You can continue your mother's care, but it will require you to sign over full ownership of Mitchell Medical Supplies to one of my acquisition companies. The transfer will clear her hospital debt, and I'll ensure she receives the best possible comfort care for her remaining time." David's throat felt like sandpaper because she was offering him a devil's bargain, his mother's final dignity in exchange for his family's legacy. "And if I refuse, then your mother will be transferred to county care in 72 hours, and your company will be liquidated by creditors within the month anyway," Emma said, with the clinical detachment of someone discussing weather patterns rather than destroying lives. Either way, Mitchell Medical Supplies ceases to exist. The only question is whether your mother dies comfortably in a private room or in a crowded ward where the nurses are overworked and the equipment is outdated. The trap was perfect because Emma had left him no real choice, but David's pride made him ask the question burning in his chest. What about Jessica? What about my daughter? Something flickered in Emma's eyes. Pain, perhaps. Or the ghost of the woman who'd once wanted children so desperately that she'd endured years of invasive treatments and monthly disappointments. Your daughter is innocent, she said finally, and I'm not a monster. The house is paid off. I bought the mortgage 6 months ago through another shell company, and I'll transfer it to Jessica's name. Your child will have a home, but you'll have nothing else except the knowledge that you destroyed your life by valuing the wrong things. David signed the papers 3 days later in a conference room that smelled like lemon polish and regret, but his hands shook so badly that the signature looked like a child's scrawl. Emma didn't attend the signing, sending her lawyers instead. But David felt her presence in every clause that stripped away his identity and his future. His mother died 2 weeks later, comfortable and pain-free in a private room, with round-the-clock nursing care that Emma had authorized. But David couldn't decide if that mercy made the revenge crueler or kinder. The funeral was small, but Jessica didn't attend because she'd left him the day after learning about the bankruptcy, taking their 6-month-old daughter to live with her parents in another state. You lied to me, Jessica had said, her pretty face twisted with anger and disappointment. You told me you were successful, but you were broke the whole time we were together. I didn't sign up to raise a baby in poverty. David had wanted to explain that Emma had orchestrated his downfall, but the words had stuck in his throat because the real truth was worse. He'd orchestrated his own destruction the moment he'd decided his wife's worth was measured in fertility rather than capability, love, or partnership. 6 months after losing everything, David worked at a medical supply warehouse loading trucks for $12 an hour, but the job was something Emma had arranged through connections he didn't understand. The manager had hired him despite his lack of references and had even advanced him money for a security deposit on a studio apartment that smelled like mildew and defeat. He'd tried to see his daughter twice, but Jessica's lawyer had filed for full custody and child support that took most of his paycheck, leaving him barely enough for ramen noodles and regret. The irony wasn't lost on him that Jessica had been so eager to give him the child Emma couldn't, but that child had become another thing he'd lost through his own arrogance and blindness. The news reached him through a forwarded email that seemed designed to maximize his pain. Emma Hartley had been named Healthcare Innovator of the Year by the American Medical Association, but the article detailed her rise from research scientist to medical tycoon. There were photos of her cutting ribbons at new hospital wings and shaking hands with senators, and in every image, she looked powerful and complete in ways that had nothing to do with motherhood or marriage. The article mentioned her brief marriage to a medical supply executive who failed to recognize her potential, but David knew he was more than unrecognizing. He'd been actively dismissive, treating her accomplishments as hobbies while building his identity around a company that had been surviving only through her secret support. She could have been open about it, David muttered to his empty apartment, trying to kindle anger from the ashes of his humiliation. She could have told me who she was. But even as he said it, he remembered the times she'd tried to share her excitement about a new patent or a successful licensing deal, and how he'd half-listened while scrolling through his phone or thinking about sales projections that had never materialized. She had told him, but he'd been too self-important to hear her. The final twist came on a Tuesday, 1 year exactly from the day he'd signed the divorce papers that had set all of this in motion. David received a package at the warehouse with no return address, but inside was a thumb drive and a note in Emma's precise handwriting. "You destroyed our marriage by blaming me for circumstances neither of us could control, but you never knew the full story. Perhaps it's time you learned what you threw away." The thumb drive contained medical records that David initially didn't understand, but as he read through them on the warehouse computer during his lunch break, the horror bloomed like poison in his chest. The infertility hadn't been Emma's problem. It had been his. A childhood case of mumps that his mother had mentioned casually years ago had left him with severely compromised sperm count. But Emma had discovered this fact early in their marriage and had never told him. Instead, she'd endured years of treatments and tests and monthly disappointments, letting him blame her while she quietly sought solutions that might have worked if he'd been willing to try IVF or adoption. But David had refused those options, calling them unnatural and insisting that real men don't need science to have children. The medical records included a notation from a fertility specialist. Patient's husband shows classic narcissistic patterns and unwillingness to accept male factor diagnosis. Patient has requested we attribute infertility to unexplained causes to preserve marital harmony. Emma had protected his ego at the cost of her own reputation and emotional well-being, but he'd repaid that sacrifice by divorcing her for a woman who'd gotten pregnant almost certainly by someone else. David now realized with sick certainty. Jessica's timeline had never quite added up, but he'd been too flattered by her pregnancy to question whose child she actually carried. The package included one more item, a check for $50,000 and another note. "This covers 1 year of child support for your daughter because she deserves a father who can afford to see her. Don't thank me. Use it to become someone worthy of being her father." David cashed the check with hands that felt like they belonged to someone else, but he didn't use the money the way Emma probably expected. Instead, he hired a lawyer and a private investigator, and within 3 months, he had proof that his daughter wasn't biologically his. Jessica had been sleeping with her regional manager the entire time she'd been dating David. The paternity test results freed him from child support, but also from the one thing that had given his destruction meaning, and David found himself sitting in his car outside St. Augustine Memorial, watching the lights in Emma's top-floor office and trying to understand why she'd given him money to support a child that wasn't even his. "Because she's a better person than you ever were," he said to his reflection in the rearview mirror, and for the first time in 2 years, he was completely honest with himself about what he'd lost and why. The final note came another 6 months later, delivered to his new apartment, a better place that David could afford, because he'd been promoted to warehouse manager and had been saving every penny beyond basic survival. The note contained just 3 sentences in Emma's handwriting. "I forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because carrying anger is exhausting. Live a better life than you did with me. And David, consider therapy. You need it more than you need revenge or redemption." David did get therapy, and over the course of 2 years, he slowly built something resembling a life that had value beyond status and legacy. He never saw Emma again except in occasional news articles about her expanding healthcare empire. But he kept that final note in his wallet as a reminder of the extraordinary woman he'd been too ordinary to appreciate. The brutal revenge had left him bankrupt and regretful, but Emma's final mercy had given him something he'd never expected, a chance to become someone different, someone better, someone who measured worth in character rather than fertility or finance. It wasn't the ending he'd imagined when he'd signed those divorce papers, but perhaps it was the ending he deserved. And somewhere in a hospital tower, overlooking the city, Emma Hartley continued building her empire, childless but never empty, powerful and complete in ways David was only beginning to understand that true strength required. The charity gala at St. Augustine Memorial's new pediatric wing sparkled with champagne and designer gowns, but Emma Hartley moved through the crowd with the effortless grace of someone who'd long ago stopped trying to impress anyone. At 42, she'd added 4 more hospitals to her empire and had been profiled in Forbes as one of the nation's most influential healthcare executives. But the achievement that made her smile tonight was the Children's Cancer Research Center that bore her mother's name. "Dr. Hartley, the ribbon cutting is in 10 minutes, her assistant murmured, but Emma was already moving toward the new wing's entrance where photographers had gathered like well-dressed vultures. What she didn't expect was to see David Mitchell among the crowd of donors and supporters, though he looked so different from the man she'd divorced that she almost didn't recognize him. The expensive suits were gone, replaced by a simple but well-tailored blazer, but more significantly, the arrogance that had once defined his posture had been replaced by something quieter, humility perhaps, or simply the weight of hard-earned wisdom. Their eyes met across the lobby, but Emma didn't look away because she'd stopped running from her past the moment she'd decided to weaponize it. David approached slowly, as if afraid she might summon security, but his hands were empty, except for a small envelope that looked worn from being carried too long. "I wasn't sure you'd want me here," David said, his voice lacking the confidence that had once irritated her with its unfounded certainty. "But I've been volunteering in the pediatric ward for the past year, and I wanted to see this moment." Emma's eyebrows rose slightly because this information hadn't reached her, though she made a mental note to ask her volunteer coordinator why a man named David Mitchell had slipped through without triggering the alerts she'd placed on his name years ago. "Volunteering? Reading to kids during their chemotherapy sessions," David explained, and there was something raw in his expression that suggested this wasn't performance, but genuine purpose. "My therapist suggested I find a way to give back that wasn't about my ego or my redemption, but about just showing up for people who needed someone to care." The admission was so far removed from the man Emma had married that she felt a strange vertigo, but she gestured for him to walk with her toward a quieter corner of the lobby. "And have you found redemption, I mean?" "I've found something better than redemption," David said, handing her the worn envelope. "I've found accountability and a life that has meaning beyond what it gives back to me. That envelope contains the last thing I owe you, the truth about what your revenge actually did." Emma opened the envelope with careful fingers, but inside was a single sheet of paper, a letter written in David's handwriting, though the penmanship was steadier than she remembered. "Dear Emma, you broke me and I deserved to be broken. But what you did after breaking me was give me the pieces and the space to rebuild into something that wasn't built on arrogance, entitlement, or the belief that my worth came from things I possessed rather than who I was. I spent 3 years in therapy learning that my narcissism wasn't just about you or our marriage. It was a pattern that destroyed everything I touched because I couldn't see value in anything that didn't reflect my own ego back at me. Jessica wasn't my victim. She was a mirror showing me that I chose relationships based on what they gave me rather than what I could give. The bankruptcy forced me to start over with nothing, but nothing turned out to be the best teacher I ever had. I learned to load trucks with dignity, to accept help without resentment, to measure my days in kindness rather than accomplishments. But here's the truth you never knew. Discovering that the infertility was mine, not yours, didn't just destroy my ego. It freed me from the lie I'd been living that biology determined worth. I spent years blaming you for not giving me children, but I never once asked if you wanted them for yourself, or if you wanted them because I demanded them. I met someone 2 years ago, a woman who can't have children due to cancer treatment in her 20s, and when she told me this on our 3rd date, I told her it didn't matter because I'd learned the hard way that family has nothing to do with DNA and everything to do with showing up. We got married last month in a small ceremony, and we're fostering 2 children who needed a home more than we needed biological legacy. I'm not writing this to ask for your forgiveness, because you already gave me that, and I'm still learning to accept it. I'm writing to tell you that your revenge worked better than you probably intended. It didn't just bankrupt me financially, it bankrupted the person I was and forced me to build someone new from the ground up. You were right about everything, Emma. I was the problem. I was the broken one, and I threw away the best thing in my life because I couldn't see past my own reflection. Thank you for destroying me. It was the greatest gift you could have given, even if it took me years to understand that. David. Emma folded the letter carefully, but her throat felt tight with emotions she couldn't quite name. You're fostering, she said finally, looking up at David with eyes that held something other than the cold satisfaction she'd felt 5 years ago. 2 boys, ages 6 and 8, David confirmed, pulling out his phone to show her a photo of himself with 2 smiling children at a park. Marcus has ADHD and a history of abandonment issues, and Tyler is on the autism spectrum and barely spoke when he came to us. But they're ours now, and watching my wife love them without biology mattering has taught me more about real parenthood than I learned in all my years of demanding biological children. The irony wasn't lost on Emma. David had finally become a father, but only after learning that fatherhood had nothing to do with the fertility he'd once prized above everything else. And your wife knows? About our marriage? About what happened? She knows everything, David said quietly. I don't keep secrets anymore because secrets were how I justified my worst behavior. She knows I was a terrible husband to you, that I blamed you for my own shortcomings, and that you had every right to destroy me the way you did. The ribbon cutting happened with the usual ceremony and speeches, but Emma found herself distracted by the sight of David in the pediatric ward afterward, reading Where the Wild Things Are to a small girl with no hair and eyes too old for her 7 years. His voice was gentle but engaging, and the child laughed at his monster impressions in a way that suggested this wasn't his first time visiting her. That's Sophia, a nurse said, appearing at Emma's elbow with a chart. She's been here for 6 months with acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Mr. Mitchell comes 3 times a week, and she always perks up when she knows he's coming. Says he's her story dad. Emma watched for a moment longer, but her mind was processing the disconnect between the man she'd married and the man reading to a dying child with no agenda except to make her smile. How's her prognosis? Good, actually, the nurse said with genuine warmth. She's responding well to treatment, and her family is optimistic about remission. But Mr. Mitchell still comes, even though he knows she'll probably recover and won't need him anymore. That's how you know it's real, when someone keeps showing up even after they're no longer needed. The observation struck Emma with unexpected force, because David had never shown up for her in the ways that mattered. But here he was, showing up for strangers with a consistency that suggested fundamental change rather than performance. They met again in the hospital cafeteria an hour later, both carrying coffee that tasted like it had been brewed sometime last week, but the awkwardness between them had softened into something approaching comfortable silence. I don't expect anything from you, David said finally, stirring sugar into his coffee with focused concentration. I'm not here looking for absolution or friendship or anything that would make this easier for me. I just wanted you to know that the woman you destroyed wasn't who I was supposed to be, and the man I'm becoming is grateful you cared enough to force that change." Emma studied him over the rim of her cup, searching for traces of manipulation or ulterior motive, but all she found was exhaustion mixed with quiet determination. "Do you hate me for what I did?" "I spent 2 years hating you," David admitted. "And then I spent another year hating myself for hating you when you'd only given me exactly what I deserved. But hate is just anger with nowhere to go, and my therapist helped me understand that I was angry at you for holding up a mirror I couldn't avoid. And now? Now I'm grateful," David said simply. "Not in a masochistic way, but in the way you're grateful for a surgeon who removed a tumor even though the surgery hurt like hell. You cut out the worst parts of me, Emma, and yeah, it nearly killed me, but I'm healthier now than I was when I was married to you and lying to myself about who I was." The honesty was almost painful in its directness, but Emma found herself respecting this version of David in ways she'd never respected the man she'd married. "I wanted to hurt you," she confessed, her own honesty surprising her. "I wanted you to feel every bit of pain you'd caused me, magnified and concentrated until you understood what you'd done." "Mission accomplished," David said with a slight smile that held no bitterness. "But somewhere in the revenge, you also gave me a roadmap out, even if you didn't mean to. The money for child support, the job at the warehouse, the medical records, each thing was a piece of truth I needed to face. You could have just destroyed me and walked away, but you kept leaving breadcrumbs that led me toward becoming better." Emma hadn't thought about it that way, but looking back, she could see the pattern. Each calculated move had been both punishment and potential salvation, destruction mixed with the tools for reconstruction. "Maybe I'm not as cruel as I thought I was," she said quietly. "Or maybe you're exactly as cruel as you needed to be," David countered, but with enough residual love to make sure the cruelty served a purpose beyond just causing pain. They talked for another hour, but the conversation stayed in safe territory. David's foster children and their progress, Emma's plans to expand into rural health care, the strange healing that comes from accepting that some relationships end badly, but don't have to end in permanent mutual destruction. "I should go," David said finally, checking his watch with the careful attention of someone who'd learned that being late was a form of disrespect. "I'm picking up the boys from school, and Marcus has anxiety when we're not on time." "David," Emma called as he stood to leave, surprising herself with the impulse. "The volunteer coordinator position in the pediatric wing is opening up next month. It's a paid position, and it would involve coordinating all the reading programs and family support services. If you're interested, I'll make sure your application gets a fair review." The offer hung between them like a bridge neither had expected, but David's eyes widened with something that looked like hope mixed with disbelief. "You'd hire me? After everything?" "I'd hire the person you've become," Emma corrected. "The person you were wouldn't have lasted a week in that position, because it requires empathy, consistency, and the ability to show up for people who can't give you anything in return. But the man who reads to Sophia 3 times a week and fosters children who need stability, that man would be excellent at the job." "I don't deserve this," David said, but his voice cracked slightly. "Probably not," Emma agreed, "but those kids deserve someone who understands that showing up is the whole job, and you seem to have finally learned that lesson. Send me your resume, and we'll go from there." 6 months later, Emma stood in her office reviewing quarterly reports, but her attention kept drifting to the email from the pediatric wing director, praising the new volunteer coordinators, innovative programs, and genuine rapport with families. David had transformed the department with support groups for parents, extended reading hours, and a foster family mentorship program that connected current foster parents with families in crisis. "He's the best hire we've made in years," The director had written, "Completely lacks ego, shows up early, stays late, and the kids adore him. Whatever happened in his past, he's clearly learned from it." Emma saved the email in a folder she'd never admit to keeping, but seeing David succeed at something that had nothing to do with his own advancement gave her a satisfaction that felt different from the cold triumph of revenge. This was something warmer, more complex. The recognition that sometimes the best revenge isn't destruction but transformation, giving someone the tools to become better than they were, even if they'd hurt you unforgivably. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Thank you for the chance. I won't waste it. D." Emma typed a response, deleted it, typed another, but finally settled on something simple. "I know, that's why I gave it to you." She didn't expect friendship with David. Some wounds were too deep for that kind of healing, but she'd discovered something more valuable than friendship. The knowledge that her revenge had been powerful enough to break a man, but precise enough to leave him the pieces he needed to rebuild into something better. The legendary medical tycoon stood at her window overlooking the city, childless but surrounded by purpose, powerful but no longer driven by pain, and for the first time since signing those divorce papers 7 years ago, Emma Hartley felt something close to peace. David Mitchell had taken everything from her that biology could offer, but she'd taken everything from him that arrogance had built. And in the ashes of that mutual destruction, they'd both found versions of themselves that were somehow more complete than what they'd been together. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it wasn't hatred either. It was something new, the recognition that revenge, when done with surgical precision, could be both devastation and gift, ending and beginning, the closing of one story and the opening of another. And in the pediatric wing 3 floors below, David read Charlotte's Web to a room full of children who didn't care about his past mistakes, only that he showed up and made the scary hospital feel a little less frightening, which was perhaps the only redemption that mattered.